And I'd like to thank J-Sei for hosting this talk, and thanks also to Stan Yogi for moderating. Today's talk is a mashup of two books that I've published, Queer Compulsions and Discriminating Sex. Queer Compulsions trace the life of immigrant poet Yone Noguchi to argue that norms of the day facilitated interracial and same-sex intimacies at the turn of the century, even as we may see these actions as rebellious today. Why is this significant? First, because the past typically gets a bad rap. We usually believe that across time we have progressed as a society and we today are more evolved than those 100 years ago. This is called the progress narrative, and we would clearly know that it's not always true. This kind of flat linear thinking, in fact, disables us from using history more productively to shape our present for a better future. Things in the past are not just a compilation of errors that we should avoid in the future, but can additionally offer innovation and inspiration in addressing today's problem. The second reason it's important to think about personal desires as shaped by norms of the day is because sexuality in the 21st century is more conventionally seen as not socially constructed, but something innate and biological inside of you. And we can see this most obviously in Lady Gaga's pop song, Born This Way, but also in mainstream LGBT politics that uses the logic of being queer as genetic and unchangeable, when in fact the scientific community has not been able to find a gay gene. My second book, Discriminating Sex, then argued that sex and sexuality as a form of leisure served as a vehicle to solidify the American, quote, Oriental, again, at the turn of the century. This argument is in fact significant since it sheds light on how Chinese and Japanese, formerly seen as two separate races, became the single, quote, Oriental through white folks talking about sexuality. And it also illuminates how leisure, typically seen as a harmless activity, advances white supremacy. So for today's talk, I hope to extend the two arguments in my previous publications and assert that, quote, Orientals, and in particular Japan and the Japanese, both imagined and real, played a central role in making of the modern gay identity. I'll be using Yone Noguchi from the first book and the Baker Street fellatio ring from the second book to make this case. Today's argument speaks to two foundational works in Japanese American history and queer history, Issei by Yuji Ichioka and Gay New York by George Chauncey. These two have since defined the field. Sexuality has largely been omitted from Issei history, and Asians are non-existent in the making of a modern gay community. If you studied Asian American history, you might already know that the late 19th century is typically known as a time of great sexual deprivation for Asian men trapped in bachelor societies with no women and ostensibly no romance and no sex. Yet Yone was hardly pining away by himself as a lonely bachelor in San Francisco. He wrote love letters to Charles Warren Stoddard, impregnated and declared marriage to Leonie Gilmore, became engaged to Ethel Arms, and was making out with other Japanese immigrants, or Issei, such as Kosen Takahashi, all within a 7-year window. Mm-hmm. And who is Yone Noguchi? Noguchi arrived in San Francisco in 1893 in hopes of becoming an English language poet. By 1900, he had published several books of poetry in English, and literary critics considered him a rising star. He later returns to Japan and becomes even more famous, eventually becoming the department chair of English literature at Keio University. After the 1950s, however, Yone became better known as the father of acclaimed artist Isamu Noguchi. You all know Isamu Noguchi. He's the famous modernist sculptor and artist. Perhaps some of you have a Noguchi table in your living room, or you have a paper lamp for whom the original designer was in fact Isamu Noguchi. So when Yone lands in San Francisco in 1893, he can only find low-paying, mind-numbing work. He's too exhausted from his day-to-day work to cultivate his poetic ambitions. So he moves to Palo Alto in hopes of gaining more knowledge by being close to Stanford, but then ends up washing dishes again at the Menlo Park Hotel. He's washing dishes so much that his hands are turning blue-black and swollen. He's feeling extremely depressed when this other Japanese fella who's sneaking back into the kitchen for an extra dessert says, there's this hermit who lives in the Oakland Hills who curses at San Francisco from across the bay. This hermit's name is Joaquin Miller, and he loves Japanese, quote, boys. So much so that he invites them to come live with him for free room and board. Perhaps some of you have been to Joaquin Miller Park in Oakland. That's the same guy. So Yone packs up his stuff and treks out to Oakland, meets Joaquin Miller, and immediately moves into his home in 1895. I just want to mention that Yone is not the only Issei who lived with Miller. Miller was deeply devoted to Japanese houseboys who he called, quote, brownies, and even wrote publicly against anti-Japanese sentiment in California at the time. From Miller's home, affectionately called the Heights, Yone, in his 20s, introduces himself to Charles Warren Stoddard in his 50s via letter, and the two develop a passionate correspondence. Charles lavishes love on Yone with each letter, and these affections from Charles are in stark contrast to the daily abuses Yone faces from the rest of anti-Asian San Francisco, where groups of roving young white men regularly spat, threw stones, and chased Japanese and Chinese San Franciscans down the block. Charles quickly becomes Yone's, quote, dad, and Yone becomes Charles's, quote, kid, in a more erotic rather than solely paternal way. Charles's letters are so exhilarating that Yone showers them with kisses upon their arrival. Yone was also not the only Japanese kid that Charles adopted. Charles often commented that Yone was special among all the Japanese boys. Charles Warren Stoddard is famous as well. He is known as San Francisco's first gay author with the publication For the Pleasure of His Company. And even though this isn't true, the fact he's not San Francisco's first gay author, but what is true is that he is also the founder of the elite fraternal society called the Bohemian Club. To this day, the Bohemian Club doesn't allow women to join, and many presidents, as well as other powerful politicians, have been members of this club. In fact, former President Richard Nixon, a Bohemian Club member since 1953, declined an invitation to speak at the club in 1971, noting privately that, quote, Bohemian Grove, which I attended from time to time, is the most faggy goddamn thing you could ever imagine with that San Francisco crowd. I can't shake hands with anybody from San Francisco. So Charles Warren Stoddard was one of its early founders in the late 19th century, and he was a certified rice queen, which according to Urban Dictionary is a, quote, homosexual male of non-Asian descent who is predominantly attracted to Asian males, end quote, hence rice and queen. For Charles, his desire for Yone was motivated by his image of him as a sensual Oriental, filled with primitive eloquence. Yone's eyes appeared to Charles as a window of a temple full of mystery, his body made of ivory. Charles once complained to Yone, who refused to wear a kimono, quote, you are far too Americanized. Soon after, they began their correspondence, and Charles sent Yone train fare. Yone headed east to meet Charles in person at his Washington, D.C. home called The Bungalow. There, he meets Ethel Arms, a journalist who would later become famous as the first historian of Alabama through the publication of her book, The Story of Coal and Iron in Alabama, and Ethel immediately becomes magnetized by Yone. Yone then moves on to New York City to begin writing on his own. In New York, he hires Leonie Gilmore to edit his writing line by line, and they end up living together as, quote, man and wife. At some point during Yone's brief residence in New York, he also begins dating Ethel Arms, the journalist who he met at Charles's bungalow, and soon after, they become engaged to marry. Ethel finds Yone fascinating and agrees to marry him because she finds him so unlike a man. Ethel, in fact, prefers to be married to women rather than men, and says to Yone that she could only be married to him if it's just for a year. She was likely a lesbian. In 1904, Yone returns to Japan and waits for Ethel to join him as his wife, even as Leonie, now in Pasadena, has just given birth to their son, who would later become the acclaimed artist Isamu Noguchi. For sure, Yone might seem like a renegade in his intergenerational same-sex love with the older Charles, his then simultaneous affairs with two other white women, since state law banned marriage between whites and Asians. Yet Yone was more accurately a manipulative Lothario. He in fact deceived both Ethel and Leonie into thinking that he was monogamous while professing love to Charles and sharing kisses with at least one other Issei man named Kosen Takahashi. As transgressive as his affairs might have appeared in heteronormative and anti-Asian San Francisco, his affairs occurred within the confines of acceptability and reflected the ways in which seemingly self-determined private actions were actually fueled by social mores of the time. On the eve of Charles's introduction to Yone, their potential affection for one another took on greater significance beyond simply an attraction between two people. Japan and America had sparked a romance of their own as the two nations struggled to satisfy their deepest desires through each other. A modernizing Japan that had long feared foreign imperialism sought to make ties with the West in its realization that it could no longer maintain its isolationism. Many Japanese, in hopes of adopting, quote, the progress of the West, embraced American technology, styles, and values. For Americans, Japan offered a cure to a cultural malaise brought on by industrialization. Despite, quote, progress or economic growth, Victorian intellectuals felt that the quality of life had somehow declined. The US then turned to Japan to regain a more spiritual and pure civilization. Art historian William Hoseley noted, quote, like lovers, Japan and the West were eventually drawn to one another by yearning for wholeness and fulfillment. Bohemians such as Charles Warren Stoddard and Joaquin Miller were obsessed with things Japanese. By 1891, several members of the Bohemian Club had traveled to Japan and published on Japanese culture and aestheticism. Japanese decor, such as rice paper lanterns, enlivened Bohemian life. At that year's Christmas Jinx, the theme song of the Orientalist musical Mikado by W.S. Gilbert and Arthur Sullivan opened the event. Moreover, in 1892, at the Midsummer Jinx, club members rallied to the theme of Buddha. North of San Francisco Bay in Mill Valley, sculptor Marion Wells and his assistants erected an enormous statue of the Buddha, modeled after the famous Daibutsu in Kamakura, Japan. Surrounded by redwood trees, the plaster Buddha stood 70 feet tall at the foot of Mount Tamalpais in a grove called Sequoia Canyon, now known as Muir Woods. More than 200 Bohemians enrobed in white and red kimonos wound their way to the sacred spot to worship the surrounding trees and find a higher spiritual consciousness. For San Francisco Bohemians, Japanese culture thus served as a familiar and useful tool to further their intellectual and artistic development. As they appropriated what they believed to be authentic Japanese culture to enhance their spiritual lives, these, quote, cultured white men would embrace Japan and its people as a conveyor of leisure and exotic titillation. Yone then indulged the white literary community's fascination with Japan, even as he gnashed his teeth over their Orientalism. For example, in his book titled American Diary of a Japanese Girl, Yone takes on the persona of a frivolous Japanese maiden, Miss Morning Glory, to critique America, but ultimately appears to propagate rather than combat stereotypes of Japan by creating a hyper-feminine, vapid protagonist only concerned with looking pretty and chasing boys. Yone's ability also, his English ability also never really got, quote, good enough, as other accomplished writers from Japan, such as Inazo Nitobe, author of Bushido, noted that the only reason Yone received any acclaim was because his writings fulfilled American fantasies of Japan. Moreover, at this time, it was relatively acceptable to have romantic same-sex friendships in the late Victorian period. However, while Bohemians nationwide recognized homoeroticism and bisexuality as central to Bohemian life, they refused to be characterized as sexual deviants or as, quote, homosexuals. Many took up with gender-appropriate spouses to protect an acceptable heterosexual persona. Hang on one sec, my cat is Zoom bombing me. Okay, just sorry. Men happily married could then share their bed with other men without stigma. Noguchi observed that Miller, while married to a woman, shared his bed with a man of color. For those who knew about Stoddard's unusual attachment to men, the trait remained, quote, an eccentric affectation of bohemianism rather than sexual depravity. Not until World War I, when soldiers gathered in places like the Presidio and started emptying their wallets to both male and female sex workers, did officials become concerned with, quote, homosexuality as a social problem. On February 16th, 1918, 9 months before the end of World War I, police began a 10-day raid of 2 residences at 2525 and 2527 Baker Street to end a, quote, vice ring that had been going on for 2 years. A large number of, quote, vicious men had used the apartment as a rendezvous site after Hugh Allen, a singer, and Clarence Thomas, a decorator, had begun renting the flats. The police had placed, quote, a Chinese servant to collect evidence. By the end of the 3-year investigation, 31 men had been implicated, from which 19 had been formally questioned, including businessmen, office clerks, 2 police officers, and military personnel as high-ranking as a colonel. Some escaped arrest or possible imprisonment by leaving town, going as far as to skip posted bail. Others who went to court found the outcome in their favor due to weak prosecutorial evidence and no corroborating witness. Many of the actual sex acts took place in a darkened room with the lights off, which made definitively identifying individuals particularly difficult. The 2 police officers involved in the sex ring, Ignatius Connors and Joseph Murray, escaped prosecution after the police chief declined to pursue criminal actions once they resigned from their positions. The public, for the most part, believed the men got away with more than they should have, even as many of the men faced public shame with the publication of their names in the local press. Broker Edgar Spiegelberg, who became implicated, shot himself in the head. Still, many believed that, quote, unusual efforts were being made to evade punishment for these men. So much so, a new grand jury convened to investigate. The renewed investigation revealed a vibrant network of well-established men who approached each other on street corners and establishments throughout the city. A number of them drove cars, considered a luxury in the 1910s, and held memberships, again, to the elite Bohemian Club. The earlier mentioned Spiegelberg seemed particularly active, approaching young soldiers on the streets, offering rides in his machine. Sorry, folks, my slideshow is just, okay, there we go. In San Francisco, at the time, it was quite normal for unacquainted men to approach one another with acts of kindness. So much so that 18 and 19-year-old soldiers regularly accepted friendly solicitations without hesitation from strangers. Local newspapers took pride in how San Franciscans offered rides and gifts to soldiers who came to the city. Spiegelberg would arrange meetups at specifically the, quote, Oriental Sultan baths and Turkish baths, and then invite them for dinner and drinks at 2525 Baker Street. These men would also cruise along Geary Street, looking for men admiring Japanese and other, quote, Oriental art through a shop window as a signal that they too might be, quote, queer. The young men questioned, perhaps not surprisingly, claimed it was their first time to encounter such parties of all gentlemen and no ladies, where men sang and shared poems and short stories. Upstairs, a second party would begin. On the upper floor, partygoers could partake in fellatio and anal sex, more commonly known as, quote, browning. Across the country, people perceived the Baker Street vice ring as typical of California, and more specifically, San Francisco's lack of morals, where, quote, perversion steadily grew. Outside of the city, the scandal at times grew bigger than actuality, particularly for those already appalled with San Francisco and all that it signified. In April 1919, Michael Williams in the Catholic World claimed that more than 1,500 names, a millionaire and a clergyman among them, including some very well-known people of San Francisco, women as well as men, are in the hands of the police, recorded as habitués of this resort, a place like the one in Taylor Street in London, where Oscar Wilde and his circle celebrate with their orgies. Yet 2525 Baker Street served as more than just a place of men celebrating their orgies. Men shared stories of past love, as well as theories on how men became, quote, temperamental or, quote, queer. At one of the gatherings, Richard Hodling explained to 24-year-old salesman Ralph Teichman that being temperamental was inherited and determined by nature, that it was not a crime, and people who are made queer are not to be blamed for it. And indeed, love, rather than sex between men, seemed to be the more horrific outrage. Grand jurors pressed for confessions that someone specifically loved another and that they were, quote, in relationships with one another to demonstrate the infamous crime against nature. The implicated men notably scoffed at the grand jury's accusations that they fell in love at Baker Street. Still, the club did in fact serve as more than just a site of anonymous sexual pleasure. It provided a space of intergenerational intimacy and queer affirmation in a world in which men deemed temperamental lived in the shadows. In January 1919, nearly a year after the initial arrests, the California State Supreme Court weighed in on a particular case involving Don Gono and Clarence Lockett. Authorities arrested the two men for, quote, fellatio. The term fellatio, however, did not appear in any English language dictionary. While the word's verb form fillet originally applied to a child at a mother's breast, the Roman poet Martial used filator to refer to what the court described as, quote, sexually degenerate practices with no other specificity. To make matters more confusing, both sexologists Havelock Ellis and Richard von Krafft-Ebing described fellatio as an act between a man and a woman, which did not apply in the case of the all-male Baker Street Club. Stedman's Medical Dictionary additionally defined fellator as the one who takes the buccal part in fellatorism, or the active agent, and then simultaneously cited fellatio as a synonym for fellatorism, and in turn irrumation, which applied to, quote, the passive and not to the active agent in a, quote, perverted practice. Without a clear definition of what constituted fellatio, between members of which gender and in what position, it would become impossible to actually be convicted of fellatio by its very meaning. Thus, the Supreme Court ruled that the prosecuting an individual for a crime not clearly definable was unconstitutional, voiding Section 288A of the California Penal Code that cited fellatio as a federal offense, since the word, according to the Supreme Court, was as esoteric as if written in Egyptian or Mexican hieroglyphics or in Japanese or Chinese characters. The court reasoned that fellatio, with its Latin origin, was unintelligible to a man of common understanding. While the investigation lingered for 2 more years until 1921, all cases would eventually be dropped, and those who had been sentenced would also be freed. 6 months after the investigation ended, the story of Taka appeared in the Overland Monthly, a Western literary journal understood as, quote, the organ of San Francisco. In October 1921, Florence Estella Taft traced a same-sex romance between a white man, Fred Robinson, and his, quote, Jap servant, Taka. The 2 men meet in college. Taka quits school upon Fred's graduation to cater to his every need. Fred is in fact married to a woman named Miriam. Miriam doesn't like Taka and asks Fred to send him away. Fred refuses, and Miriam realizes that there's mutual affection between Fred and Taka. Miriam then tries to tell Taka herself that he needs to leave. Taka then raises a dagger in hopes of stabbing Miriam, but bumps a vase, which falls to the ground. Fred then appears from the crashing vase, and Taka, sensing his disappointment, plunges the raised dagger into himself. In 1921, a Japanese homicidal, homosexual, and eventually suicidal college dropout could play the perfect role in enacting a convincing and compelling same-sex love triangle in the wake of the Baker Street vice ring. And this is why. Testimony from the Baker Street Club underscored how much, quote, Orientals and Orientalism had come to inform the formation of modern gay sexuality. A Chinese servant could secretly collect evidence at the residence without raising suspicion. The Supreme Court stated fellatio as esoteric as Chinese or Japanese characters rather than a term understood in common English. In the 1910s, men looking for intimacy with other men spotted one another admiring Japanese and Oriental art along storefronts on Geary Street. They would later go specifically to a Chinese lodging house to lie in bed together, or frequent the, quote, Oriental Turkish bath and Sultan Turkish baths for gay sex out of the more than 15 possible bathhouses available. Keep in mind also that anal sex, known as browning, was remarkably close to the nickname brownies that Miller and his friends assigned to, quote, Japanese boys. The Chinese at this time were racialized as yellow. The Baker Street Club, too, even as its members faced persecution, poignantly served as an instance of an expansion rather than repression of how men forged intimacy and fulfillment with one another outside of the conventions of the heterosexual household. And while the Baker Street men faced 3 years of irrevocable trauma in being coercively outed and investigated, the Supreme Court ruled to acquit them of the charge of fellatio to, quote, value the liberty of the individual, even the most debased wretch in the land. For the fictional Taka, however, his century-long life as an Asian American homo was just about to begin. In conclusion, I'd just like to underscore what I hoped I illuminated today regarding the central ideological role Japan, Japanese masculinity, and the broader Orient played in the formation of a gay identity at the turn of the century. It was for sure in large part about how whites saw Japan, but it was also actual Issei and their interactions with Bohemian whites in particular that transformed the ways in which American same-sex sexuality took shape in the late 1890s and early 1900s into a vibrant community that supported and found shelter in one another on not just Baker Street in San Francisco, but in the Oakland Hills and Washington, D.C. as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. If you appreciated Amy's talk, you can use the clap function on Zoom. So I'll do it physically, but please feel free to use the Zoom options as well. Again, if you have any questions for Amy, please put them in the chat function and I'll moderate them for Amy. While you're thinking of your questions or typing them in, I have one for you, Amy. So how did you come to decide to focus your academic work on queer Asian Americans and Japanese Americans specifically?
Sure. So when I was in grad school, I knew I wanted to do immigration history. And at the same time, I was super interested in sexuality. And I was reading all the queer histories that were coming out at that time. This is in the 90s. It was a pretty exciting time. There's also a lot of queer theory that was coming out, and it just was very revelatory, life-changing for me, as I too was coming out at the same time as a queer. So I think I wanted to do something at the intersection of immigration and sexuality, specifically queer studies. And Stan, you sort of mentioned this, but when I was beginning my research, a number of faculty said that it was impossible for me to do the project, or that queer immigrants didn't exist. It's just a whole host of things that I heard. And eventually I got 2 assistant professors to take me on in their dissertation committee, which is unheard of. Usually assistant professors don't chair dissertation committees, but I did get 2 faculty members who are both assistant professors to help me out. So that's sort of how the project came to be.
And when did you first learn about Yone Noguchi?
Yeah, so I was looking at San Francisco and I was reading everything that I could about gay San Francisco at the turn of the century and reading everything that I could about Japanese San Francisco at the turn of the century. And so I knew about Yone and I knew about Charles separately. And I noticed that in Yone's early book of poetry, it may have been Seen and Unseen, but I can't remember exactly. He had dedicated his book to Charles Warren Stoddard. And then I was like, ding, 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 like all the lights went off, right? And then I started digging through Charles's letters. There's a collection of letters for Yone Noguchi as well, and just looking for any kinds of correspondence between the 2 of them, yeah. And then I basically found a treasure trove of love letters, mostly from Charles to Yone. And then, a few from Yone to Charles as well. So I got really lucky. It helps that the people I was looking at were kind of famous, and they had big enough egos to believe that their materials should be saved, right? So they were saved at both the Huntington and the Bancroft Library.
And you mentioned Kosen Takahashi. Can you tell us a little bit more about him and how you discovered him?
Yeah, so Kosen Takahashi, there's a person named Ikuko Atsumi, I believe. She actually has a collection, it's called Unpublished Letters of Yone Noguchi. And she has a number of letters from Yone in there, as well as from Charles Warren Stoddard. And then there's a letter there that Kosen actually wrote to Blanche Partington. Kosen was an illustrator for the Shinsekai, an early Japanese American newspaper in San Francisco. And he was definitely in love. I mean, if you read this letter, he was totally in love with Yone, and they evidently kissed. And Yone had taken a trip tramping to LA. This is what folks did back in the day to look for work. They would tramp across like the state of California, for example. And so Yone had gone on a tramping trip and he wasn't back yet. So he wrote a letter to Yone's editor at the time, who was Blanche Partington, and said, oh, you know, Yone and myself were the queerest Nipponese boys ever. And I miss Yone's kisses. And when is he coming back? My heart is broken, right? And Ikuko Atsumi initially said, you know, she's a scholar from Japan. And she had said in her interpretation that, oh, during this time period in America, men are expressing love for each other. It's totally normal. Doesn't mean anything. You know, it just means that they're really good buddies, right? And then obviously, me being a queer, I refused to take that interpretation and decided to dig a little deeper. And what I did was I compared a whole bunch of letters between like Yone and Charles, and then also letters between Yone and other people, and then Charles and other people who weren't romantically involved, but still romantic friendships. And they were markedly different. And you can see the difference between someone who's passionate about their friendship and between people for whom there's something else going on, another layer of intimacy.
So I have another follow-up question about Yone, but first there's a question from Ying Wang. How can the LGBTQ plus community or individuals begin to unravel Orientalism within our community? And I'm assuming that means the broader LGBT queer community.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a question I feel like more for us as a collective, right? I do think that not everyone is Orientalist, I hope. And I do think that there's good white people out there, good non-Asians who still like Asians, right? You see us as people. I don't think all sort of everyone, you know, I don't think everyone who's not Asian who supports Asian Americans has to be an Orientalist. And so I do think that there's a way in which we need to kind of, you know, be aware of it, right? I think what I was also trying to do was to point to how Yone himself also capitalized on it, because he didn't have very many options available to him. And so part of my goal in doing that was to not villainize him for also, you know, participating in the Orientalism. And I hope that as an Asian American community that we can also not villainize our siblings, right, who might have to resort to Orientalism in order to advance in a white supremacist society.
So Jim Ferris has a question that's kind of related to the follow-up I had. So his question is, did Yone leave any commentary about his heterosexual and homosexual experiences and how it all played out in his life? And I want to tag on to that. I know when he moved back to Japan, he became ultimately very right-wing. So if you have any comments about that transition or that transformation, and
yes.
You might have some thoughts on
yeah.
this.
So when Yone first came to the US, like many immigrants, he was shocked at the level of racism. And he left the US really pissed off at white people, pissed off about Orientalism, but also pissed off about the way white folks condescended to Japanese in particular, because he's Japanese. So when he went back to Japan, he became a rabid Japanese nationalist, and believed in basically the Japanese imperial, government regime taking over the world, including the U.S. And I do think that he wrote quite a bit. He wrote quite a bit about his own life. He wrote something called Story of Yone Noguchi as told by himself. And what's clear is that in his writings from Japan and in Japanese, he writes about himself exclusively as straight. Like he has these, he writes these big books, and then in the intro chapter, he insists on talking about his wife and his children, okay? But when he's writing in English, he doesn't do any of that. And when he was in the US writing love letters to Charles, he wasn't married, but he did have a baby on the way. But he did not declare his heterosexuality so adamantly. The irony is that in Japan, Yone was never at home. He was always hanging out at the Buddhist temple, having overnight trips there or whatever. He rarely came home. He did get married to a Japanese woman in Japan and had several children. And then Leonie Gilmore also joins him in Japan with Isamu. And then Isamu finds out later that he had this second family, and it's devastating to him. But there is a way in which he deliberately kind of hid his same-sex sexuality when he was in Japan. And then when he was in the US, under the guise of romantic friendship, he's able to expound on his affair with Charles Warren Stoddard in a number of writings, right? But then in his personal letters, when he writes letters to Ethel Arms, as well as to Leonie Gilmore, he talks about Charles being like super needy and like, I don't really like him that much, but, but meanwhile, he's writing these love letters to Charles. So I do feel like he was trying to downplay his male love affairs to both Ethel and Leonie. I mean, it's really quite sad. I remember, I told Stan this before, but when I was writing Queer Compulsions, which is the title of the first book, my heart was literally breaking as I wrote the chapters of the kinds of conflicts that Yone was having. And I don't, before I came out, I was straight, and I would always get fetishized by white guys, right? They would come up to me and say ni hao or konnichiwa or those kinds of things. And so both, I think that that also fetishization that Yone faced rang very, very close and true to me as well, where you're trying to find a way in which to be a part of America, to be seen as a human, but then to only be seen as a geisha is also deeply, deeply painful. And I'm sure, and that also, as I wrote about Yone facing that, it was also quite heart-wrenching for me to write about as well. Yeah.
So there are two questions that sort of relate to what you just said. And so I'll read the first one from Kei Matsuda from J-Sei. Were there some stereotypes about gay Japanese men at the time influenced by stereotypes that European American men held about Japanese or Asian women, such as the Madame Butterfly image or the geisha image? Yeah,
so in the 1890s, Japan is not that familiar. So there's a book, I'm blanking on the author right now, I'm sorry, because as I've gotten older, my brain has been starting to lose some cells. But there's a book it's called Unfamiliar Japan is the name of the title. It's written by a very famous author. I'm sure there's someone on this call that knows the author of this book. You could throw it into the chat box. I suspect that Andrew Leong may know the author of this. But anyway, so there's this author that writes about Unfamiliar Japan. And Americans largely have no idea what Japan is about. The only way they understand Japan is through this aesthetic movement called Japanisme. And through Japanisme, basically, Japan is gendered as female in some ways, right? So it's not really about stereotypes of Japanese women per se, but it's about Japanese gender as always being cultured and also feminine. Oh yeah, Lafcadio Hearn, thank you very much. Thank you to Josephine and Andrew, thank you. And so what happens is that it's not a bad thing, right? It's not a bad thing in the 1890s to be feminine, for men to be feminine, right? There's this idea at the time also in American consciousness that of bisexuality, meaning a body embodying both male and female sex, not bisexuality as an orientation. And during this time, women in America are increasingly becoming assertive and independent. Divorce rates are going up. Women are wearing bloomers and riding bicycles, talking back to their husbands. And so men are increasingly saying, we really need to get back to our evolutionary origin as bisexual beings. So we don't need women to procreate. We can just self-fertilize and propagate on our own, right? Note that there is no bisexual woman. It's always the bisexual man, right? So in that sense, men at this time are seen as being able to embody both the feminine and the masculine. And it's a positive thing. And so the geisha, the stereotype of the geisha is not necessarily projected onto the Japanese man, but the Japanese man is seen as aesthetic and refined as part of Japanismo.
So related question to that, kind of bringing it into contemporary times, is a question from Kinji Imada. Considering how Japanese men were sexualized in a certain way by the mainstream American society at the turn of the century, could you perhaps hint on your ideas about how that affected the Japanese American community in terms of how we present ourselves to the mainstream / white society?
Oh, today or back in the day?
I think more today. I mean, Kinji, please clarify if you don't mean that, but I think over time as well.
Yeah.
From the turn of the century to today.
So, even representations, I mean, maybe this is obvious to everyone, but representations are constantly changing and they flip-flop. They can actually be opposite of each other. And literary critics are fantastic at tracing this, right? So we see in the 1890s, Japan as a country is seen as feminine. Japanese men are seen as poets, as artists, as masters of flower arrangement, right? But then the Japanese Russo War comes, Japan kicks Russia's ass, and all of a sudden white people are like, oh my God, Japanese people are scary, right? And so now there's stereotypes of like warriors and sexist Japanese men oppressing their women at home, right? And so one could argue that all of these stereotypes then come to compile our consciousness today around how society sees us, right? So the yellow peril, one would argue, is both threatening and exotic, right? It's like all these different ways that are mashed together. One of the things that I did argue in discriminating sex was that even in the 1890s, when Japanese men were seen as cultured and ideal, right? Aesthetically ideal, that they couldn't get jobs. They could only get jobs cleaning and cooking, right? It's not like all of a sudden they were hired to be home decorators or they were teaching classes at the Y on how to, be cultured. They weren't teaching painting classes. Opportunities were still closed off to Japanese immigrants in the US, even as one might argue that these representations were, quote, positive, right? And so part of what I argue is that white folks in enhancing their leisure would take up these ideas about Japanese aestheticism to enhance themselves, right? To enhance their leisure lives. So they would wear, like Mari Yoshihara talks about how women on the East Coast were wearing Japanese kimono and having Japanese tea instead of English tea, right? But it doesn't mean that these white women were then running out and, being involved in advancing Japanese immigrant rights, right? Fighting against anti-Japanese discrimination, right? Or even, giving a scholarship to a young Japanese student to go to college. They weren't doing any of that. They were just wearing their kimono and drinking, green tea and eating yakizakana, basically. And so there's a way in which representations definitely inform how people perceive us, and then also sometimes don't have the kinds of positive material consequences, even if we think the representation is positive.
So there are two related questions that have to do with same-sex relationships among Issei or among other Japanese immigrants in the diaspora. So I'll read the first one. I found, this is from Christian Alonso, I found the nebulous legal interpretation of fellatio and resulting inability to prosecute it as a crime to be fascinating.
Yeah.
I studied a similar application of, quote, infamous crime against nature, unquote, in California history. Many of the prison records and documentation of court proceedings are extant. Have you studied any specific cases involving Issei? And then the related question is about same-sex relationships among Japanese LGBT folks in the diaspora, if you've come across any accounts of that.
Like outside of the US, is that correct? Like in Brazil and Canada?
Yeah, that's how I'm interpreting this.
All right. Okay, so the first question, oh yeah. So the first question, I could not find any, you know, what's fantastic now is that everything is digitized, right? So you could punch in Japanese crime against nature, and I could not find anything, but, you know, maybe, you know, some of you researchers will be better than me, involving Issei and these kinds of crimes against nature. I did find a couple of obscenity cases. This guy named Bunzo Washizu, I guess he sent around a pornographic magazine, which I wanted to get a hold of, but when I went to the National Archive, they didn't even have a copy of the journal. They just had you know, the criminal proceedings, but not the journal, which I was deeply bummed out about. But I did actually find a number of Chinese folks, right? As well as a whole bunch of South Asians. And Nyan Shah has a great book about all these South Asian tops, basically penetrating homeless white youth along the coast of California, Washington, as well as some in Canada as well. So if you do the kind of, you know, the word search through all the court cases, you'll be able to find them, especially if they went, I think, to the appellate and the state Supreme Courts. Peter Bogue, who's a historian, queer historian, he says that his work on, he did an equivalent of Gay New York, basically for the Pacific Northwest, George Chauncey's Gay New York. And he argued, he was also fascinated by the state's inability to figure out what fellatio means. And he said that wasn't the case for them in Oregon. So I don't know if that's interesting to you. And then also, Clarence Lockett was in fact African-American. I didn't mention that in the talk, but he was African-American. So that's also another interesting thing to note, I think, and deserves further study.
And Clarence Lockett was one of the men who was involved in that case that went to the California.
Yeah. He wasn't part of the Baker Street vice ring, but it was Don Gono and Clarence Lockett. It was their case where the California State Supreme Court decided that they couldn't define what fellatio meant. The common person had no clue what it meant, so they basically vacated all the charges.
And the second question that was related to this was about any evidence of same-sex relationships among Japanese immigrants in the diaspora besides the US.
Yeah, so I did not do that. I didn't go there. So when I was a grad student, we didn't have many things digitized. So I had to read 3 Japanese newspapers, as well as the daily press, day by day, page by page, line by line, from 1895 all the way to 1924. And that was quite a lot for me to do. Now things are digitized. So if you want, I mean, I think you should just, I mean, I don't know if Canada's newspapers are digitized or Brazil's are, but if they are, I just punch in the words that are appropriate for that time period, and you should be able to find a whole bunch of stuff. So for this exhibit, Seen and Unseen, I was able to go into the Hoji Shimbun database at Stanford. It's a relatively new database, meaning, I don't know, maybe 5 or 7 years ago. I can't remember when it started, but it's relatively new and it is like a gold mine. So I just punch in things like crime against nature or homosexuality, or I think Greg Robinson may have punched in pansy, right? And you'll just get all these articles that pop up. Even the Japanese language stuff is actually cataloged in the database. And so I would type in nanshoku or danshoku, right? And then a whole bunch of articles also came up in Japanese. And that's part of what's in the exhibit, is that something that I was not able to address in my book, which I can definitely see now, and what other folks like Andrew Leong has argued, is that Issei, when writing in Japanese, were not as homophobic as later Nisei would become.
So several people have the question that BZ is raising. Thank you very much for your fascinating talk. I'm sure other people share that sentiment too. It's interesting that the US perceived Japanese and Chinese differently, as brownie and yellow. Could you say more about why the two ethnic groups were orientalized in distinct ways, and how this difference affected the way to perceive Japanese and Chinese sexualities in the late 19th century?
Sure, sure. So this is basically the core of my second book, Discriminating Sex. But I argue that Chinese and Japanese were seen differently, right? And this makes sense in 1890, because there basically aren't any Japanese in America until after the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? So the Chinese Exclusion Act happens in, I believe, 1882, and I'm sorry if I got that year wrong. And basically what happens is that Japanese laborers are then, moved into the country. They're recruited to come to the US. And what we see is that there's a specific way in which Chinese folks are racialized. They're seen as yellow, right? And when the Japanese come, they're seen as an ideal replacement for Chinese. And so they're even in the census, like you see, it's like white, and then they use a category Negroid, right? And then they have Chinese as a racial category. It's not Asian. And it's not until later that Japanese are added to the census. And in the early 20th century is when we see even the word Oriental start to pop up in the press. And I look specifically at San Francisco, but again, you could do this for any part of the country, probably nationally. I typed in Chinese. Actually, I typed in not Chinese, I typed in Mongoloid to see how many times it popped up. And then I typed in Oriental to see how many times it popped up. And this is in newspapers, right? And what's great again about this database is it actually draws a graph for you. So, right? So as Mongoloid is rising, right? There's no Oriental. And then Mongoloid starts decreasing. And then you see the word Oriental starting to rise in frequency in the newspapers. And part of what I argue in Discriminating Sex is that people start to conflate Chinese and Japanese in things like short stories, right? And this is in Discriminating Sex. And these short stories are inevitably about sexuality, about romance, about women getting kidnapped and being brought to the US, and then being saved by a missionary, right? So they talk about, like, there's this one story that's in Discriminating Sex. It's a great example. It's the story of a Japanese woman who gets kidnapped from China and gets sold into, one of those, basically sexual slavery, but one of those things that from the cage that you look at. And that cage thing was different, a distinctive Chinese American woman's experience for the earlier period, right? And also in the illustration, the character is wearing like one of those Chinese crowns, right? It's not a Japanese thing that she's wearing, right? And so there's a number of short stories where they start conflating both Chinese and Japanese culture, and then it becomes basically the Oriental. And that's sort of what I argue in the book. But you can, like, now with the databases, it's really easy to see sort of the rise of the word Oriental and then the decline of the word Mongoloid, and that's when the two sort of come together. Also in the book as well, you see this in the morgue, where the Chinese bodies are late, because you put the race of the body when you find them in the morgue. The Chinese bodies are marked as yellow, and the Japanese bodies are marked as brown in terms of color. And then that also begins to merge. Some Japanese are then marked as yellow, increasingly as we approach the 1920s.
So you've addressed this somewhat in the answer to the last question. This is Nancy Ukai's question, and I'm trying to find it again. What kind of cultural attitudes towards being gay would the Issei men have had when they came to the US in the late 1800s?
Yeah, so I want to be clear that there is not sort of a gay identity as we understand it today. It's about same-sex sexual activity or same-sex intimacy, right? And in Japanese culture, from the Edo period, Greg Flugfelder has a book about this, this intergenerational same-sex love and intimacy was considered quite common and also a part of Japanese society, particularly for the noble class. They would take on a younger man to be kind of like a lover, right? And we see this also in Japanese, what's called high theater, right? So in things like kabuki as well, there are a number of sort of actors who were having relationships with other actors, right? And so the Issei, when they came from a long tradition of male same-sex sexuality that was quite known and public, maybe not totally embraced, right? Maybe some people thought it was a little, something that you shouldn't always do, but for a specific class or for a specific time in your life, like maybe when you're young and then you grow out of it. But what happens is that with the Meiji era, right, Japan is increasingly starting to modernize, trying to modernize. And there's lots of other scholars who talk about this. It's not really my wheelhouse, but they try to take on more Western morality in Japan. And this is happening in the 1880s, 1890s. So things like, the public baths, which used to be co-ed in Japan, become single sex, right? Because Westerners are appalled that men and women would bathe together naked, right, in the same pool. And so that becomes sex segregated. It's also interesting because, like, I was, for my first book, when I was working on Yone Noguchi, I was reading articles from the Yomiuri Shimbun, and there's all these articles about the judo club and how there's like gay sex happening at all these various judo clubs, right? And it's definitely like, I felt like it was a moment in the newspaper where all of a sudden gay sex at the judo club becomes a problem. But even in Inazo Nitobe's book, Bushido, there's a chapter in there about male same-sex sexuality and romantic relationships, right? And Leonie Gilmore, Bushido is very popular when it comes out in the US. It's written in English. And Leonie Gilmore and all these other Bohemians are super excited about it. But they do also notice the chapter on same-sex sexuality. So Leonie Gilmore's like, yeah, I'm gonna raise my son in Japan because I think Japan is way better. Like he's gonna come out way more aesthetically inclined, way more cultured. But I do have issue with that one chapter. This is like some letter that she writes to one of her besties. And she doesn't really say what the chapter is, but she kind of suggests that it's around sort of male sexuality and sort of morality, questions of morality around that. I don't know if that was helpful.
Alex has a related question. Can you speak to the differences in homophobic sentiment between Issei and Nisei generations?
I mean, I think that there's, it's in the exhibit, we argue that Issei, pre-war Issei, right, were not as impacted by rising American homophobia that's taking root after World War I. So after World War I, like all these social commentators are noticing that, soldiers are gathering and doing things that they shouldn't be doing with each other, as well as with male sex workers. In San Francisco, it's really about sort of male soldiers emptying their wallets to male sex workers. And these are, all the soldiers are actually male at the time. So that becomes an issue. And as well, there's a rise in sexology, right? Where increasingly there's some discussion around same-sex sex acts as being sort of an illness, right? Whereas previously, people didn't really talk about it that much. And so there's a rising consciousness of both actual men having, being intimate with other men, and also a rise in sexology, right? And the medicalization of same-sex sexuality. And those things obviously shape everybody who's in the US, right? You can't escape it. It's all around you. It even seeps into the newspapers. So depictions of same-sex sexuality become more pejorative, right? And we see this particularly in the JA press. It's interesting because in the same issue, You can have a homophobic, clearly homophobic article written by a Japanese American in English, and then have one that's written in Japanese, like in the Japanese language, that is not necessarily homophobic, just kind of matter of fact. It's not the same article about the same content, but they do address same-sex sexuality. And so I do think that there's a way in which American norms have shaped Nisei, Sansei, and now, Shin Issei, Shin Nisei mentalities around same-sex sexuality. Part of what Stan and I wanted to do with this exhibit was to question the automatic assumption that we have that Issei are narrow-minded homophobes, right? We weren't totally sure that we should just assume that. And so if you actually go to the sources from the 1890s and 1900s, you might actually say that our ancestors did a better job accepting the queers among us than we do for ourselves today.
So there are two related questions that kind of dovetail with what you've just been talking about. One is from Anna Eng, and that is there some kind of comparable romantic friendships, quote unquote, homosocial culture in Japanese culture at this time? I'm assuming that means the turn of the century, and you sort of alluded to this when you answered Nancy's question. So that's one. And then the related question is from Jane Yamashiro. Thanks for this great talk. You mentioned same-sex intimate relationships as common, especially for the noble class. Would you know if there were class differences, if lower class Japanese also viewed sexual intimacy in the same ways?
Yeah, so what you'll find is if you read both the Yomiuri Shimbun, which is in Japan, as well as the Japanese American press in the Japanese language, is that there are a whole bunch of schoolgirls who are actually having romantic friendships with each other, right? And it's more than just romantic friendship, like how we imagine them as innocuous, but they're quite intense. And in the newspapers, they're all basically reporting on a suicide, right? So these two young women, right, they can't see a way to live with each other. And so they end up basically killing themselves, and it shows up in the newspaper. There's one article that we also posted, that Stan and I posted for the exhibit. It's about a suicide activist in Japan who's now focusing on, quote, the acute problem of lesbian suicides, right? So she's running out trying to save all these women who are Japanese in Japan, who are presumably lesbians, from killing themselves. Again, it's not a homophobic depiction, right? Like necessarily. The fact that she's trying to save these lesbians from killing themselves, I think is pretty notable. But maybe my bar is quite low. But yeah, there are definitely there's more kind of intense female friendships that we can see in the press, in the daily newspaper. That's not about nobility. That's not about nanshoku, like the traditional Edo period kind version. I don't know about, if the question is about, I didn't read as much about I didn't find articles about men who were like peers, middle class or working class, who would then decide to kill themselves. I did not find those articles. Those were almost all about Japanese women.
Got it. And we have just one final question before we have some announcements. And we want to ask you to complete an evaluation form as well, which will just take a couple of minutes. And that final question is from Willie Wilkinson. And that is, did you, in your research, come across any history of Chinese queer people, Chinese American?
Yeah, so there's actually quite a few sodomy. I shouldn't say a lot. I would say that I only searched from 1880 to 1920, right? And I found maybe 5 Chinese folks. This is as opposed to 0 Japanese, and as opposed to like 20 South Asians. So there's one guy named Dong Pok Yip in Alameda County who was caught supposedly getting a blowjob by a miner in the shipyard. And it's this Portuguese guy that finds them and reports them. But both the miner, who the courts claim is mentally challenged, claim that in fact, the minor says that, no, Dongpo Kyip was actually asking about my sister. He wanted to, you know, hang out with my sister, right? So we don't really know what exactly happened. We do know that Dongpo Kyip gets charged with crime against nature, right? And then there's a court transcript that talks about the three of them and each of their testimony. It's basically this Portuguese, you know, sailor guy who's working the docks, this miner who's white, and then Dongpo Kyip who's Chinese. A fascinating story that deserves further research for sure, and also very accessible on LexisNexis, you know, in the legal database. If you type in Chinese and crime against nature, as well as other keywords that were used during that time for same-sex sexual activity, then these things will just pop up.
Wow. Thank you. For those of you on this call who are graduate students, it sounds like Amy has given you plenty of ideas for dissertation topics and research topics. So thank you for that to Amy. And while Jill shares her screen and puts up a PowerPoint with some announcements, please again thank Amy. Join me in virtual or literally clapping for her presentation and for answering the questions. It was, like, as I predicted, super fascinating. So thank you, Amy.
Thank you, everyone.
So we promised to share the link to how to access the Seen and Unseen exhibit. So these are two ways. So you can go directly to the website or access it via J-Sei. And again, there is going to be a Japanese language version available any day now. So please look for that, even if you have already visited. And Jill, if you want to go to the next slide, we want to thank our funder who funded not only the exhibit, but also this talk and two more talks that are going to come up, which we'll explain in a minute. And Cal Humanities would appreciate your feedback. So if you can just take really literally a couple of minutes to fill out a survey. The link to the survey is in the chat function. So please, either in this moment or after you log off this call, complete the survey. And then we also want to thank our community partners who have publicized the exhibit and this program and the two upcoming programs. And I specifically want to give shout outs to Evan Sakuma from API Equality LA, and also to J-Sei, our sponsors for today's program and the exhibit, hosting the exhibit, and to Diane Wong, who's Executive Director, and Kei Matsuda, who is on the board. And then finally for me, we have two upcoming programs related to this exhibit. So on November 17th, Andrew Leong, who we've referenced throughout this program, is going to give a talk on Issei and Issei literature and writers. So please join us for that. And then on December 1st, Tina Takemoto, who's an artist, scholar, and filmmaker, is going to share two short experimental films based on queer, or inspired by queer Issei, and we'll discuss those. So I know these are going to be super fascinating talks as well. And you can visit the J-Sei website to register for those